1,000 songs. And it goes right in my pocket.
Failure of the future has to be a nation that is agile, that is innovative, that is creative.
Innovation. Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about innovation in the enterprise, brought to you and run by Collective Campus, an innovation hub based in Australia that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methodologies and tools to successfully explore new business models and disruptive innovation in an era of rapid change. For more information, go to www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared. Today I bring you Evangelos Simoudis. He's been working in Silicon Valley as a technologist, entrepreneur, corporate executive, and VC. Today he advises global corporations on startup-driven innovation and information technology and invests in early-stage startups working on big data applications. He's a recognized thought leader on corporate innovation, big data, cloud computing, and digital marketing platforms. He's also a writer and speaker on these topics. In 2014, Evangelos was named a power player in digital media, and in 2012 was named a top investor in online advertising. His current directorships include Amobee, Singtel, and Kite. Prior directorships included Brightroll, which was acquired by Yahoo, Bristol, which was acquired by HP, Composite Software, acquired by Cisco, Confluent Software, acquired by Oracle, Exelate, acquired by Nielsen, and Princeton Softech, acquired by IBM. Prior to his investing and advisory career, Evangelos had a 20-year career in high technology executive roles, including 2 startup CEO positions. And I'll have to apologize before this podcast gets underway. We did have some slight technical difficulties during the interview, so you'll probably pick up on that at moments across the interview. But look, nonetheless, there are so many amazing morsels of knowledge throughout this 1-hour podcast. I think in terms of return on investment in your time, you definitely need to listen to this because Evangelos's insights are quite thoughtful and thought-provoking. So please give this a listen and give it an hour of your time, whether it's on the way to work or on the way home. I'm sure you'll get a lot out of it. So without further ado, I bring you the one, the only Evangelos Simoudis. Welcome to the show, Evangelos.
Very nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
No problem. It's an absolute pleasure. And first, let me say I'm a big admirer of your work. I think the thought leadership you put out on corporate innovation is quite insightful and definitely differentiated from a lot of the stuff that's basically flooding the interwebs at the moment.
Thank you.
So you've recently started working with Steve Blank on a new model for corporate innovation. Do you want to talk to me about how that all came about?
Well, Steve and I know each other for many years. We are friends, and we developed our friendship actually initially by competing. Mm-hmm. I was the CEO of a company called Customer Analytics, which was competing with Epiphany. We both had a good outcome from our respective efforts. Mm-hmm. His was much greater than mine, but mine was good enough to make my investors happy. And over the years, so this is late 90s, over the years we have kept the relationship. We found that we care about similar issues, particularly around startups. He went to develop his interests around academia, and I went to develop my corresponding interests around venture capital. We both, though, have been working very intently and intensively with entrepreneurs. Right. And then more recently, the last couple of years, as corporations started becoming interested in innovation and the ways of the startups, we found ourselves again writing about similar topics, and we continued to meet, and at some point we decided to start writing together. So it's, you can call it a natural outcome of an evolving and close friendship.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So competitors become collaborators, I suppose, if you will. So how's that all tracking? I noticed it's probably been about a year or so in the making.
So we started really working together in the fall, we found that many of the top, the first piece of work that we did was around innovation outposts. Through that, as we kept digging further into more central issues for corporate innovation, we started realizing that there isn't really a language for effectively discussing these issues. Corporations have, even among themselves, they do not have a common language.
Yeah.
So I would call right now our work as being in the process of constructing such a language. And in fact, we've had several people, from entrepreneurs to corporate executives, asking us, when the book is going to come out. And it's, believe me, we would very much like to push something out quickly.
Yep.
But the more we work on it, the more we realize that the topic requires a lot more thought and attention than, frankly, we originally anticipated. There's a ton of material on innovation, some of it coming from scholarly sources, some of it coming from more experiential sources, and a lot of it, frankly, is noise. We talk to a lot of corporations, and we're finding out that they're not, by and large, they're not benefiting from what's already available. Right. So that causes us to want to think more, as I said, more intensively and keep digging to try to understand what are the core issues, what we can offer to the entire discourse on corporate innovation. And more importantly, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, define a language that will enable corporations to start working with startups more effectively.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And, there is absolutely no silver bullet when it comes to corporate innovation. It's not like you can just say, hey, let's take Lean Startup and apply it to a company. There's so many, you can apply Lean Startup internally. There's so many barriers to actually using it effectively. And I think one of them is that communication between teams internally, whether it's marketing, speaking to finance, speaking to product, to sales, to legal. Everybody needs to be on the same page. Otherwise, you just won't be able to move at that speed, which is fundamental to success when it comes to disruptive innovation.
Correct. And one of the points one of the observations that we started making as we started working together is that in addition to the Lean Startup, so with the Lean Startup, Steve and his collaborators created a methodology. They cracked the code, as I keep calling it, on how to create startups.
Yes.
I did my first startup in 1990. Steve started working with startups a little bit before then. And as we were both saying to one another, in those days, everything was very experiential. We were, and some of the lessons that we were learning were expensive, not only to us as founders and entrepreneurs, but also to our investors. And I think the very important step, the very important contribution that Lean Startup made is that it provided a language and almost like an algorithm of how to create startups, and that has reduced the cost of doing such endeavor, and more importantly, has reduced the risk.
Yes.
We're in that in itself as a body of work is particularly important for corporations to understand, and many of them have started adopting it. GE's, for example, adoption is well documented by now, and there are obviously other companies that are doing that. But we think that there is an additional set of methods, templates, whatever, from other parts of the startup ecosystem, from the investors of the startup ecosystem, from the recruiters that work in the startup ecosystem, from even the bankers that work in the startup ecosystem. And we think that all of these methods are very appropriate for corporations to consider as they are trying to work through startups in order to innovate. So it's not only about lean, but there's a bunch of other templates and methods. And with the work that we're now doing jointly, we're hoping that we will be able to define those and identify also the situations under which these templates are the right ones to use.
Yeah, and I think that makes perfect sense. And I mean, a couple of things I wanted to touch on there. One, we see that a lot of corporate decision makers think that applying lean startup is risky because there's so many unknowns and because there's no big grand plan up front. But the fact is that it reduces risk because you find out much earlier in the piece whether your assumptions are flawed, rather than spending 5 or 10 times as much money with a big complex plan to figure that out. And I know GE's had that experience in their industrial business unit.
Yes.
So one thing, I guess I wanted to explore some of the work you're doing with Synapse Partners, which ultimately looks to improve the innovation capabilities of large organizations through a number of different channels. And some of the topics I wanted to touch on today were around corporate venture capital, acquisitions, and corporate incubators and accelerators. So, I mean, we're seeing a lot of organizations, particularly here in Australia, big banks setting up corporate venture capital arms. What are some of the things that perhaps they should be thinking about before they set up a venture capital arm?
So, a lot of times when I get involved with corporations, I'm asked to help them analyze the effectiveness of these vehicles, these innovation enablers, as I call them, because many corporations, unfortunately, confuse the establishment of a venture arm or the establishment of an accelerator as doing innovation.
Yes.
And what I try to impart on them is that these are enablers to innovation, but by themselves, they do not constitute innovation.
Correct. They're just isolated initiatives on their own.
Right. And it is, again, in many cases, corporations believe that by investing in a few startups, they will be able to innovate, and most of the times, what they find, most of the times, what they find very expensively, I will add, is that this type of investments, by and large, do not get them to the end result that they were expecting. So when I have the luxury to start advising a corporation from the beginning, I always try to ask the question, what are you trying to achieve here? And have you determined that startups indeed, and working with startups, are going to enable you to achieve your innovation goals, which means trying to determine what are your innovation goals? What are you trying to innovate around? What is the strategic problem that you are trying to solve through innovation, and more importantly, through startup-driven innovation. And once we get into this dialogue, then we try to determine which are the best ways to accomplish this. And in some cases, having a venture arm and investing in startup is the right way to go. But other cases, it is not. And again, when you make this type of investments, you need to be cognizant of what risk you're taking, when you may expect to get returns. We've seen, for example, in our practice at Synapse Partners, several corporations investing in early stage startups, but then not realizing that a return on that investment cannot happen in over a course of 1 or 2 years. And then you have what we're starting to call horizon conflict, in that you're looking for results in a very short-term horizon, but you're investing in opportunities or you're taking steps that have much longer term, that will give you result over much longer term horizons.
Right.
So being able to reconcile this type of conflicts is an important part of the services that the advisory services that we provide.
Is that something you see often, Evangelos, in terms of organizations applying Horizon 1 metrics to Horizon 3 innovation?
Well, I think corporations, again, in most cases, they are not able to start distinguishing, or they have not distinguished the horizons that they operate in a very explicit manner. So I'll give you a perfect example. I was working recently with a large electronics company, and they said, okay, we have short, medium, and long-term goals. Well, their long-term goals were 36 months out. Now, in a company like that, if a company like this invests in let's say an early stage startup, will provide a significant return on that investment, maybe for 4 or 5 years. So if your long-term horizon is 36 months and you're investing in something that will not get you some results in 4 to 5 years, now you have a conflict.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And it comes back to, I think, something that Steve Blank and Eric Ries have talked about, innovation metrics, as opposed to traditional management accounting metrics, which, as you're aware, is more around NPV, IRR, ROI, which tends to be quite short term. And the reality is that with disruptive innovation, it can take 2 to 3 years to generate any sort of viable returns that even begin to make a dent on those growth metrics of a large company.
Yeah. So a couple of different approaches that I am talking about is number one, if you want to think about, I believe there are two sets of horizons. Again, you can think of Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3, and you can think of this this horizon organization for your existing businesses and your existing models. So if I am a car manufacturer, an automaker, in other words, I'm thinking about my current models, but I'm also thinking about how these models will evolve over 2 or 3 generations, right? And if you think that every car model or automakers are making changes every 3 to 4 years, looking at 2 or 3 generations, that may be a 10 or so year horizon. So for you have this Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 for your existing models, but then you also need to be thinking about brand new things, right? And this is where ideas such as lean startup become very important. So Again, if I were to stay in the automotive industry, as you probably know, now automakers are having very strong competition from ride-sharing and car-sharing companies because, such as Uber, such as Lyft, because consumers are not as interested anymore as just owning cars. Well, the idea of ride-sharing is a completely new business model, is a completely new concept for the traditional automaker, right? For the incumbent automaker.
Right.
So in order to be able to address that type of disruption, either defend against it or maybe even create disruptions on their own, automakers will need to start thinking about establishing Horizon 3, new Horizon 3 concepts. And growing them, experimenting with them, and those that are most that tend to win out, that tend to show the most promise, need then to become Horizon 2 opportunities where you're putting more resources around this initial concept, and eventually become the new business units that, in other words, become Horizon 1 businesses that drive the next generation of the corporation. So you need to worry about both how your existing businesses look across horizons, but also how to take these brand new ideas that can be disruptive and make them Horizon 1, in other words, make them big, established business models. And the corporations, by and large, are good. Well, corporations used to be good at looking at their existing business models across horizons. Over the years, they have, I think they have become very good only at the short and medium term. And they have completely abandoned the second type, which is how do I take completely new concepts and ideas, which is what startups do, and create big businesses out of them. And so teasing these two ideas out, right, and making the corporation understand how to innovate on their existing business models and be disruptive there, and how to be completely disruptive by looking at brand new businesses that they haven't considered before are two big challenges. And startups can play a role in, or startup-driven innovation can play a role in both of them, but you cannot intermix the two. And this is where, again, a lot of my work with my advisory clients is going through.
Yeah, and I like you touched on quite a few things there, and I like the transition from things starting out as Horizon 3, and once there's some initial validation, they move up to Horizon 2, and eventually, if the value is there, they become the core business. And a question I was asked recently by an engineer friend from Boeing said, well, how can we innovate when we have safety concerns and regulators breathing down our neck? And I think that's looking at the world through a very Horizon 1 lens, whereas perhaps when you're talking about disruptive innovation for airlines, it could be maybe platform innovation, like you've alluded to, with the ride-sharing services, or perhaps it's something like the Hyperloop that's being worked on at the moment in Silicon Valley, which is a completely different type of transportation. It's about stepping outside of that Horizon 1 thinking.
Precisely, and again, you mentioned earlier about incubators and accelerators. Corporations need to start understanding that for these brand new concepts, which are high risk but could potentially be high reward, those need to be tested. They need to be tried in a completely different environment than your typical corporate environment. Right. But again, so from this perspective, corporate incubators and accelerators can play a very big role. But again, they need to be clearly appreciated for that type of function, as opposed to for something that will have far more immediate effects to the corporation.
So on the topic of corporate incubators and accelerators, Evangelos, you've defined 4 models that organizations should be thinking about when setting up an incubator or an accelerator. Do you perhaps want to elaborate on what those 4 models look like?
Well, that work was very much based on the interactions that I've had with several large corporations on how they should be thinking about their incubation efforts.
Mm-hmm.
What we have seen over the past couple of years is like 2 big trends. Either corporations establishing their own incubators.
Mm-hmm.
So a good example of that would be Samsung, that has its own incubator. Telefonica, which has a series of incubators. Allianz, if you want to look at a different industry in the insurance side.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have a different kind of approach where, again, corporations are looking to partner with third-party incubators. I think the one that has done the most work in this space is Techstars, where they essentially the corporation allows or asks the third-party incubator to help it run the programs, but provide, either brings its own entrepreneurs or its own employees to in order to do to incubate the teams. And again, what I want to in most cases, what I have found was that corporations do not always think of what they want to achieve out of the incubator, right? Sometimes you may want to just come close to the entrepreneurial community. This is what I call kind of the pay forward model,
yes,
where you're trying to connect yourself to the entrepreneurial community, to the community where you think from which you can derive future employees, or just some ideas. And Allianz is a very good example of a corporation that does this. If you look at it, different folks that are thinking of incubation as just a step in a broader innovation process, then these are the companies that have really understood how the output of their incubation effort can feed into maybe some early acquisitions, or maybe serve as an input to their own venture funds, so that they can continue staying close to teams which they believe will give them a potentially great outcome, without having to bring such a team into the corporate parent. And again, I would say what Samsung has done, particularly with their Internet of Things effort, the connected home and Internet of Things effort, it's a good example of that model. Also, what Qualcomm has done around their robotics and drone effort is a good example of this model. And then the two other models that I have observed, one has to do with intrapreneurship, and we're seeing more corporations now becoming interested in developing their intrapreneurs. So they're taking the incubation model in order to test certain ideas that internal teams bring up. And again, these ideas can be tested either in incubators that the corporations fully own or through third-party incubators. So I would say companies like LinkedIn and Google and Adobe are well known for developing such intrapreneur related incubation programs.
Yes.
I've been working with a couple of corporations that unfortunately I cannot mention publicly that again are starting to, that I'm advising on how to do something similar. And then the last model that I have observed is one where corporations are using this type of structures in order to test new work environments. And I think the SC Studio that Standard Chartered Bank had established in San Francisco is a good example of that. Recently, I started advising a large pharmaceutical company that again is starting to test this type of idea around their, and they have kind of like an innovation center where they're testing not only business ideas but also new ways of working and collaborating among their employees. So those are the four models that I've been that I had observed and wrote about.
Fantastic. Thanks, Evangelos. So I guess for the benefit of our listeners, the four models were a step in the innovation process, paying it forward, developing entrepreneurs, and testing new work environments. So I guess the different type of model will then lend itself to what happens post the incubator or accelerator. For example, does an organization acquire, invest, incubate, invent, or partner? Are they closely aligned to the different models, Evangelos?
Yes, they are. In fact, this is why, as I said, that the first model, which is around using the incubation as a step in the overall innovation process, is the one which, in my opinion, most closely aligned to having this longer-term vision. And it ties both, on the one hand, it ties to how you should be using the various organizations, the various innovations in your company to drive innovation from a very early stage, from the almost like idea stage, which is what incubation is all about, to the testing startup phase, which is where your venture group can come in play, to then later where you may decide that a company that you have incubated, maybe you even provided venture capital for, is now ready to be acquired, right? So that it can be integrated in some way. Again, if you look at what Google did with Nest, right? First, they invested in Nest. They were able to see how the business model, how the product, how the whole vision of the company could fit with their own vision. And at some point, they decided that the next step in that innovation process is to acquire it. So that, to me, that model, that incubation model, is the one that lends itself to having this continuity, to this progression across various horizons and the various ways of approaching startup-driven innovation.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think investing in companies or incubating companies that can become customers who you can actually contribute to their revenue in some way, shape, or form, and their increase thereafter increase their valuation makes a lot of sense. So one question we often get from organizations looking to set up incubators, accelerators, or even just run hackathons, and I think I know the answer, but for the benefit of our listeners, if someone asks, well, what about intellectual property? What do we do about that? I mean, what do you often say?
Well, intellectual, I have this concept that I use with many of my clients, which is there has to be a value exchange between the corporation and the entrepreneur in order to have a lasting and strong relationship and mutually beneficial relationship. That means that the corporation not only needs to be willing and ready to contribute to the development of that startup, and the contribution, frankly, has to be more than money. A lot of corporations come to a startup ecosystem, be it Silicon Valley, be it Herzliya in Israel, in New York, and they believe that just because of their financial resources, that is a good enough reason for a startup to work with them. And the fact is that in today's world, the financial resources is probably the least in the good entrepreneur's mind.
Correct.
So the corporations need to go beyond the financial resources, and they need to think of what type of expertise they can contribute, what kind of intellectual property they can contribute to the startup or startups with which they want to work. And conversely, then, if there is intellectual property that is developed in the process of collaborating with that startup, either during the incubation period, or after an investment is made, or after a partnership is established, the corporations need to understand that there is no way that this startup will accept for the corporation to own exclusively that intellectual property. And a lot of times, what I've seen in these kind of situations is for the corporations to go and outright buy a startup. And I think that that's not always the right way to do it, because many times corporations buy startups prematurely. They bring them into the mothership, into the whole corporate environment.
Yes.
And then they may keep the rights to that intellectual property, but they lose the most important asset, which is the people who have developed that intellectual property. So just then they end up owning a patent, but they cannot profitably exploit that intellectual property, right? As I said, they have the right, but they lose the people. And that is something which, again, I often have to spend a lot of time to educate and convince corporate executives that they cannot be thinking as they need to be thinking in a value exchange way. They need to give and take, and not only take.
Yes.
And there are certain industries where this idea of value exchange is very foreign. And those are the ones I think that will have a lot of challenges working in a startup ecosystem. And that's why, again, I go back to something I said earlier in our conversation, that when I start advising a corporation, I try very early on to determine whether they are ready for startup-driven innovation, because they can innovate in a variety of other ways without having to involve startups. But if they are to involve startups, they need to be prepared for certain things, and this idea of value exchange is one of them.
Yeah, now that makes perfect sense, and I like a few things that you touched on there. Firstly, around alignment between the startup philosophy, which is very collaborative and open. And if an organization is to work with a startup, there needs to be that sort of collaboration and open value exchange and whatnot. And you also touched on acquisitions and acquiring startups prematurely. Of course, you can acquire them prematurely, you can acquire them late, or you can also acquire and integrate them into the mothership and ultimately kill them by covering them with lots of processes and bureaucracy and legacy infrastructure and whatnot. But what we're seeing is a lot of large companies, what I'm seeing anyway, is a lot of large companies perhaps saying, well, we can't innovate internally, so we're just going to acquire our startups. But with an average deal size of almost 100 million US, and I guess a flow-on effect of that is that you're not building that innovation capability within the organization. Is relying purely on acquisitions a sustainable strategy?
Well, I think that acquiring innovation is definitely one of the plays in a corporation's playbook, but just innovating through acquisitions, it becomes a very expensive play.
Yes.
So I think that, and this is why since the beginning, since I started writing and writing this about this work and advising corporations, and as you can appreciate, the two go hand in hand and in parallel, I have said that corporations need to develop this complete playbook, and they need to also develop the signals that will allow them to determine when to use each play. And sometimes you may use more than one play in one situation. But you cannot really, if you want to effectively work with startups, I do not believe, and I've been doing this, I've been in Silicon Valley now for 25 years, 15 of those as venture investor with large and well-established venture firms before I started my own firm. So I can say that just by saying that I'm going to innovate just by investing in startups or just by acquiring startups is typically will lead to disappointment.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think you do need a playbook with lots of plays in there and a holistic approach to innovation rather than just isolated initiatives like let's just put together an accelerator, or let's just run a hackathon, or let's just run an idea contest and we're being innovative. It definitely requires a long-term sort of strategy that is aligned to that corporate strategy as well.
Yeah, in one of the pieces that Steve and I wrote, and we talk about innovation theater. And I think in the context of this conversation that we're just now having, I think it's an important term to bring up because working with startups, it's very hard. And I think that having been a venture investor for 15 years has convinced me just how hard it is. And people feel that, hey, I'm going to go invest some money, life is good, things are going to go smoothly. And only once you get into it seriously, you realize that working with startups is a hard business.
Yes.
And so a lot of corporations, because of what they're used to and how their corporate existence evolves, they feel that they'll come to an ecosystem such as Silicon Valley, they'll do a few investments, and now all of a sudden, by magic, innovation will happen.
Yes.
And these are the companies that really participate in this theater, right? They may come for a few visits, they may establish a small fund, they may do a few investments. And what we've seen time and time again, and for those of us who have been in the industry for a long time and have been in the Valley for a long time, we've seen the cycles, right? And I'm waiting right now for the next recession, which will come inevitably, right?
Yes.
Whether it is in a year, whether it will come, right? And I'm waiting to see how many of these companies that are, are around here now, either they have established an outpost or they have visits or whatever, how many of them will stay the course and continue, working through thick and thin, as they say, to try to innovate.
That's right. And I know some companies have already shut down their Silicon Valley outposts. I know Vodafone, after establishing one in 2011, recently closed theirs down and allegedly opened something in the UK now. But whether or not that's a signal of, strategic whether that's a strategic move or whether they just found that they weren't getting a return or just getting out early, I don't know. But it's an interesting move.
But let's be clear here, because I think you're bringing a very interesting point. I think that it is very healthy for a corporation to keep evaluating its needs, and determining whether the ecosystem that they have chosen to start with working with startups is the right ecosystem long term. So I'll mention a couple of examples. I've been working recently with an information company, and they determined that the best place to start their startup innovation efforts is outside the United States, and they started in Israel, and now after having a couple of years worth of experience, and they're seeing the benefits, but also what are some of the misfires. They have just determined where to open their second innovation outpost. Right. And I have really admired how the thought process that they have gone through. Another situation, actually another client of mine, where this is now over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, I worked with their chief strategy officer. Their initial inclination, which kind of almost say the default inclination, was to come and establish a center in Silicon Valley. And again, based on what they wanted to achieve, we determined that the Silicon Valley is not the right place for them to make that innovation investment. Now, they continue to come visiting us, right? Visiting the Valley and talking to various constituencies here in the Valley. But their innovation center, the one that interacts with startups, that startup innovation center, is outside the Valley. It's not in our area.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And ultimately, it's about applying that philosophy of build, measure, learn to everything you do. It's not as easy as saying, here's our corporate innovation plan, we're going to execute on this for the next 5 years and not change. You need to be adaptable. And, in some ways, people may interpret Vodafone's move as being a brave one, rather than just saying, well, look, we invested all this money setting up in Silicon Valley, so we may as well keep going. If they evaluated and found that, hey, perhaps this isn't the best strategy for us, let's change tact. I think that's a very brave move.
Right. Absolutely. And you said it. It's actually bravery, right? Because a lot of times you may realize that you've made a mistake. And that's, again, part of the startup mentality. I mean, startups make mistakes all the time.
Yes.
And some of these mistakes can lead to significant failures. And what the startup is always thinking is, how do I turn? How do I tack, if you were to use a sailing analogy, or how do I pivot, if you want to use a basketball analogy, in order to be able to find to find the road to success, the path to success. And what they always worry about is, do I have enough resources, including obviously financial resources, that will enable me to make these turns as I search for that success?
Sure, that's exactly right. And I think with startups, it's about failing as often as you can. It's about the cadence at which you make those mistakes, learn from them, and get better. And the quicker that large organizations can get at testing different hypotheses when it comes to corporate innovation, I think the more likely they are to succeed.
Yes.
So I wanted to wrap up with what I ask all of my guests. It's a bit of fun, Evangelos. The first question, and I know you've been in Silicon Valley for over 25 years and you've run your own businesses, but imagine you had to work for somebody else. If you could work for any company at any stage of their life cycle, who would it be and why?
I would actually wanted to. I always thought that Bell was a very interesting company.
Right.
When it was, as it was starting, and then because it had many firsts.
Yeah, that's a great answer, Evangelos. And question number 2, Evangelos, was if you could ask anybody, dead or alive, a question, who would it be and what would you ask them?
I'm always fascinated by some of these innovations that have changed the world, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at people like Edison or people like Shockley, or people like the Wright brothers, right, for the airplane. So I would always want to ask these people whether they ever forethought what would be the implications of their inventions and their innovations. And because we have today so many examples of innovations that started in one way and they made their mark in a completely either made a completely different area, or you hear of innovators that are talking about, I never thought of how impactful my innovation is going to be. And as I said, if you take that to kind of the next level and you see some of these innovations that can truly change the course of history, right? I would have very much like to ask these people how they thought about their the impact of what they were inventing.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a great one. For them, it may have even started out as a hobby, and maybe they had absolutely no idea what the impact would be 50 or 100 years out. It's an interesting question. And finally, I want to ask something that I ask everyone, which is about lifestyle design. So how do you get the most out of every day, Evangelos? Do you have any routines or rituals that you do on a daily basis?
So I do, and I think that most of us do, frankly. But I actually am interested in a great set of topics. Mm-hmm. So I tend to read a lot. Mm-hmm. But my curiosity is not satisfied just by reading, right? This kind of passive activity. I travel quite a bit, and I've been fortunate enough, frankly, to by my work, whether it was in the entrepreneurial side or in the corporate side, or as a scientist when I first started, and then more recently as a VC the last several years, has taken me to some very interesting places, and I've always enjoyed that, because these interactions, whether it is interactions with entrepreneurs, with business people, mm-hmm. With everyday people, I always found very important. I like to cook a lot, and even going to to all places and talking to people who cook, from street food to very high-end restaurants. And again, I've been fortunate enough to be invited to some wonderful kitchens. Mm-hmm. All that is contributing to what keeps me at least going on a daily basis. Otherwise, it becomes pretty stale.
No, that's a great answer. And I think you touched on it there, where you meet a lot of different people in different countries. That is one of the key traits behind entrepreneurship. It's having those diverse experiences and being able to connect the dots, or as Clayton Christensen says, associational thinking. And on street food, I imagine you'd be a big fan of the souvlaki, is that right?
I am a big fan of Greek food, but also of other cuisines, and
Yes.
as it happens again with this curiosity and experimentation, I try to fuse a few things, and sometimes they come out very good, and I have a lot of friends who come around with bringing good wines and enjoying the creations, and other times where I realize that more incubation is needed. But anyway.
Yes, the European and Asian fusion is very big here in Melbourne. Well, thank you so much for your time, Evangelos. You've been an amazing guest. I know our listeners can find out a bit more about the work you're doing at synapsepartners.co. Is there anywhere else they should go?
Well, a lot of my pieces are in corporateinnovation.co. Synapse Partners is the website of our new firm. So there's quite a bit of material there. And also I've been writing more recently. I've been writing a lot for O'Reilly, particularly around how corporations can innovate through big data, which is another topic that interests me immensely. I find that many of these strategic problems that corporations face today at their core have data, so I've been spending a lot of time with that.
Fantastic. I'll publish that in the show notes. So thank you so much for your time, Evangelos. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Cheers.
Well, I hope you enjoyed our chat with Evangelos Simoudis. It was definitely a pleasure and a privilege to chat to the man for an entire hour. If you've got any questions about this podcast, feel free to send an email to steve@collectivecamp.us or tweet me at Steve Glaveski. If you'd like to subscribe to our mailing list, you can do that at futuresquared.xyz. And for more on Collective Campus, an innovation school and consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia, that brings you Future Squared, head to www.collectivecamp.us. Until next time, Future Squared out.